title which brings the two areas of work in my life together into the one space. So sound, as I see it, it's also a play on words because you don't see sound in that normal sense. But of course, when we're looking at being a visual artist and a composer, and because of my interest in how sound can influence my visual art and my visual art can influence sound, there is a direct connection between sound as I see it. So in that context, I think it sums up both of these things in the one world.
Well, I was surprised to find that you weren't trained that you didn't come to music with any kind of knowledge in a way. You weren't a trained composer and you weren't a trained player, and yet you didn't even dabble with a guitar or piano or anything. You came at it with literally the blank canvas in every sense of the word.
Absolutely. Yeah, well, it was all driven by a passion and a love of music. And
but how old were you at this time when you suddenly...
it would have been my early teens. I mean, when I went to primary school, we used to have at assembly, they used to play a bit of a Mozart horn concerto and a bit of a march from Aida and things like that. And even then, this music, I had a reaction to this music. It did something. I didn't know what it was. I was very young, but I liked it. And as I sort of got into my teens, that like developed into a passion. And I had a pretty grim upbringing in many ways. And music was a sort of refuge, somewhere I could put myself, a different world, a much nicer world to be in. But as opposed to just being a consumer of it, it actually went the other way, and I started to get these feelings that I wanted to make it, this magical stuff that music is. I wanted to create it for myself, but of course I had absolutely no idea how to go about that. So it took many years and much frustration to actually teach myself how to read and write.
Well, it's interesting that you didn't take a formal online course or anything on stage and notation. You just sort of went about it in your own way.
There was no online when I was doing that, of course. This is in the 1970s. There was nothing. No, there were no courses. I was in such an isolated place, I suppose, that I had no idea about courses or training. I knew people could read and write music, and people could play instruments, but I didn't have instrumental lessons. I mean, I probably at primary school, there were recorder lessons and things like that, but I always had a very good ear, so I used to cheat, because I just used to memorise whatever anybody did, and I'd get it like that, so I didn't actually have to bother with the dots. So I went through that whole period of my life not reading or writing music, but I reached a point when I wanted to actually write my own music, that it became very clear that because musicians and composers use a code to communicate to each other, notation, that if I didn't have that code, I didn't understand that code and couldn't use it, then effectively it would be very hard for me to write music. And I didn't want to write music that was improvisation or anything like that. I wanted to write stuff that I had kind of a strong degree of control over. Absolutely, yeah. So I had to go through that particular process, yeah.
But I was interested if you were writing notes the wrong way and things like that.
Oh yes, yeah. Well, I mean, I don't know why that was. It was just ignorance, I suppose. But I used to do them in the medieval way, which is where you kind of have a dot and then the face goes forwards, as opposed to now it goes back. So my quavers all had this kind of slightly medieval look to them, and it was really quite endearing, but not right. So no, I mean, things that I didn't know I made up, and things that I did know I probably got wrong. So between the whole lot, it was a bit of a mess. But nevertheless, the imagination that was driving it forwards was very much intact. It was just I didn't have the means, to express that.
In some respects, do you think the fact you didn't learn the rules, as it were, do you think that's helped you in your composition?
Absolutely. I didn't realise that until some time on, after I did actually start writing music and getting things performed, and people actually started to say that the work I was producing had a very original sound, and where did it come from, and all that sort of thing. It came from ignorance. And I think sometimes when you're taught composition, or you're exposed to a whole range of composers' compositional techniques, it becomes very easy for the creative person to get lost by the weight of history and the weight of influences and the way that this worked. You know, try it, do it yourself, see how it sounds, and you can go through that process, and you have to be a pretty strong character to come out the other end where you're not completely swamped and influenced by everything that's gone before. For me, because I never had that, it meant that I had to, you know, truly invent my own way, and that led to everything that I do around music coming from a basis that is actually not rooted in music per se. It could be rooted in visual art, it could be rooted in geology, it could be rooted in many things about life, but not actually rooted in compositional technique. Although I have to use that to deliver the music, but that wasn't the starting point. Every other art form, if you like, influenced me, and the way I would actually approach creating music, rather than the way that music is written itself. But I must just say that listening to music was a very important part of my informal learning, but I didn't learn how to write music in the notational sense by listening to it, but I did learn an awful lot about how music works as sound on the ears.
And who were you listening to at that time?
I started off, my big passion was for Vaughan Williams and Bax and Holst. I loved the English pastoral music, and I still do. Even though the music I write couldn't be further away from it, I absolutely love it. It's a passion for me. And then starting off in that sort of particular 20th century music, I went the other way and started listening to classical music and Baroque music and early music, which I love greatly, and then slowly delving into contemporary music and discovered composers like Peter Maxwell Davies and Harrison Birtwistle.
Well, that leads you on to your first piece. Tell us your first piece that you ever wrote.
Oh,
how it was taken up, how it...
The I See Blue. Yes, I See Blue was my first orchestral piece and one of my first proper pieces, I think, really possibly like number one of my proper pieces. And I sent it off to what was then the Manchester Composers Platform back in 1994, run by the BBC in Manchester. And it was a hand-written score, which I did in biro, as I did then, and photocopied and sent off, and it was selected by a panel, and it was workshopped by the BBC Philharmonic, and it created a stir, which was fantastic. It was the first time I'd had anything played by more than 2 or 3 amateur musicians, and here was an orchestra of 100 professionals playing it, and the response was hugely positive, so much so that although this was a workshop, it subsequently went on to be broadcast 3 times on BBC Radio 3, and it was conducted by Martin Babbins and later by Peter Maxwell Davies, who conducted the BBC Philharmonic and also took it to the Gewandhaus Radio Orchestra in Leipzig in Germany. So it and me went from nowhere, from complete obscurity, to suddenly having all this...
Did you bypass the natural route, really, to get to having a symphonic piece? Orchestral piece performed?
Yes, I did, and much to some people's dislike as well. I have on my journey encountered a certain amount of jealousy, particularly I think because I didn't earn my stripes in the normal way. I didn't go to this college and have that tutor or whatever. I just suddenly came literally from nowhere into the scene, and there was a buzz and interest around what I was doing, and I was on Radio 3 and I was interviewed, and there were a number of people who resented that, really resented it. And you know, the composition world is a funny place because whilst there are some very successful individuals who are very confident and very generous and open with their colleagues, there are also a great deal of very insecure, mean and spiteful individuals who protect their own territory and will actually be destructive.